Okay, here is our interview with Stephen Meyer. The Cambridge experience must have been pretty fascinating.
It was enchanting. Yeah. Challenging, but very, very cool. Yeah.
Pretty serious luminaries from there. Didn't Hawking go there?
Hawking did go there.
Yeah.
He was there. I actually was fortunate enough to attend a lecture series that he gave that was the basis of the book, A Brief History of Time, which I address in the new book.
So, super cool. And then what about the Brilliant Mind guy? Was he there too? Remember the movie A Brilliant Mind with Russell Crowe?
Nash. Yeah.
Nash.
Nash. I think he was. And the people that were most important for my story that were there were all of the molecular biologists, Francis Crick and Watson and those folks. So those laboratories are still there. They've turned out a lot of Nobel laureates over the years. I think Cambridge still has the most of any university. University of Chicago, where you were second. So,
and your degree, your PhD really is in the philosophy of science.
It's philosophy of science, and I worked on origin of life biology. So it was a sort of, and that's the kind of the nature of the field. It's interdisciplinary, looking at questions that are at the intersection between philosophy and science.
Wow. Are there many universities that even offer that PhD?
It's a fairly common field now. University of Wisconsin is often combined with history and philosophy of science, the two together. But Harvard, University of Wisconsin, Oklahoma are three really great programs in the United States in that field. I think UCLA has probably some good people there too. So.
And just briefly again, how would you describe what it means to say the philosophy of science?
Well, the philosophy of science is looking at questions at the foundation of scientific disciplines. Sometimes questions of epistemology, and scientific methods. How do we know what we know? How do we evaluate how reliable our methods are? And then questions at the foundation of disciplines. So the question of origins is both a scientific question, but also a philosophical one because it intersects with the fundamental considerations of worldview. For example, every worldview has to answer the question, what is the entity or the thing or the process from which everything else comes? In philosophy, they call that the question of ontology. What's fundamental? What's the prime or ultimate reality? But it happens that there are scientific fields that address that same question. So there's an intersection, where we have questions of biological origins, questions of cosmological origins, and those are the things that have always interested me.
So, and then to get to the crux of your book, in the course of your studies there, was this kind of one of the things that was being considered is origins of everything and whether there's any explanation for it all?
Well, right. There's a whole field of study called origin of life research. It's mainly conducted by biochemists and cell biologists and molecular biologists who understand the complexities of the cell at a biochemical level. It's also philosophical because it raises this big question of, where did life come from? That's a question that's been debated all the way back to the ancient Greeks. And there were materialists like Democritus, and there were people who were more theistically oriented like Plato and Aristotle. And so I was very interested in the question of the scientific methods that are used to reconstruct the past. We always talk about the scientific method, but when you get into the philosophy of science, you learn that there are actually multiple scientific methods. There are different methods for different disciplines. Some of them have things in common. Some of them are slightly different. But when you're investigating the past, the one thing you can't do is replicate the events that you want to study in controlled laboratory environments. You might be able to simulate some parts of those events, but the origin events happened once or very few times, and they happened a long time ago. So you have to use different methods to study the past than you do to study how nature ordinarily works on an ongoing basis, which is what a lot of science is about. So I was not only interested in the question of the origin of life, but also how do scientists investigate that question, and what constitutes a legitimate scientific explanation of a singular event in the remote past. So it's a much more forensic style of science, where you've got the clue. My PhD thesis, in fact, was called "Of Clues and Causes." You've got the clues that are left behind. Now, what do you make of what caused those clues and what caused the events that the clues attest to? So So I was interested in the science of origin of life research and the methods of studying where the first life came from. And it turns out those methods are also used by, for example, cosmologists trying to figure out how the universe came to be.
And you're doing these studies around presumably primarily atheists.
Primarily, I think the default way of thinking in most major Western universities in science departments is certainly what you might call naturalistic or materialistic, in the sense that the assumption is that that the physical or natural world is all there is, and that world consists of matter and energy, space and time, and that's all we need consider. The challenge to that I've been making, and proponents of the idea of intelligent design have been making, is that there are features of the physical world, particularly the living world, that are indicative in our experience of the activity of designing intelligence. So can we invoke the notion of creative intelligence as an explanatory principle as we're studying, for example, the origin of life, or the origin of the information that's in life that's necessary to make life function? That's one of the indicators I was just referring to. And this was the big discovery of modern molecular biology, is that at the foundation of life, in the large, what are called macromolecules, things like DNA and RNA, there is information stored in a digital form. And in our experience, information, especially if it's functional and digital, is always the product of an intelligent agent. Bill Gates has said DNA is like a software program. Richard Dawkins has acknowledged that the DNA contains machine code. Leroy Hood, a great biotechnologist, describes DNA as simply digital code. Well, where does digital code come from in our experience? It comes from programmers. And so the discovery of information at the foundation of life, I've argued, seems to point to a designing intelligence. And in making that argument, I used the same method of reasoning that I discovered was commonly used by historical scientists, including Darwin and other great 19th century evolutionary biologists who initiated this method of reasoning. So reasoning from the effect back to the cause. If there's only one known cause of a given effect, if it's true that where there's smoke, there's always fire, you can infer, if you see smoke wafting over the hillside, you can infer that there's a fire below out of view. Well, if it's true that information in a functional and digital form always arises from an intelligent source, then the discovery of information in living systems points, I've argued, to the activity of a designing intelligence in the origin of life.
Okay. So then I want to get into that. I know that in your new book, you specifically talk about 3 particular discoveries that you think point to this, but just laying a little bit more foundation before we get into that. So what are you, as far as when it comes to your personal views about God? How were you raised as far as religion goes, and what are your current religious beliefs?
Yeah, I'm a Christian, and I was raised in a kind of nominally Catholic home. My personal conversion to my conversion to a personal religious belief took place over a period of time, about 7 years from late high school through the first couple of years out of college. It took me a while to settle in the conviction that it was actually true, and it was the scientific challenges to faith that are often presented never really bothered me. I was pretty content with an evolutionary account of things until I started to encounter this evidence about the importance of information to living systems. I was doing digital signal processing, an early form of information technology, with an oil company. I was a geophysicist when I was first out of college. I had physics and geology training as an undergraduate. And I became intrigued with this argument about, I became intrigued with the realization that the presence of information in living systems was the main reason that scientists were having trouble explaining the origin of life. That it's hard to explain how you could get from chemistry in a prebiotic soup to a functioning digital code with an information processing system, which is what we find in cells. So my scientific conversion, if you will, to intelligent design came after a religious conversion.
And so at the time that you went to Cambridge, you had pretty strong Christian convictions. Yes,
indeed. Yes, yeah. I did.
And still today. And then when we talk about, the possibility, the God hypothesis, and is that a Christian God that you believe that you were providing evidence of, as opposed to any other type of God?
It's a theistic God. I think the scientific arguments and evidence that I marshal can only take you so far. They point, I think, to an intelligence. I think it takes intelligence or mind to generate information. I think we have information at the foundation of life and information at the foundation of the cosmos as well, and the fine-tuning that we can discuss. One of the three big things I discuss in the book, and some other evidence of that. So I think you see evidence of mind, and I think you see evidence not only of a mind who has been active in the creation, but one who has the capability of structuring the whole of the universe. We see what is called the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics, the initial conditions of the universe, from the very beginning of the universe, suggesting a mind which has the ability to structure the whole of the universe. And so I think you see evidence of both transcendence as well as immanence, that is an intelligence that is active in the creation. And I think that comports well with the Judeo-Christian concept of God, but also the concept of God that has been held by other classical theists. So yeah, I don't think it helps. The kinds of evidence that I'm marshaling, the kind of evidence that I cite, and the arguments that I'm marshaling support theism versus, say, deism or pantheism, or one idea that's been proposed called panspermia, the idea that life was seeded to Earth by an intelligent alien within the cosmos. Perhaps fanciful, but some scientists have actually proposed that in recent years because they see how severe the problem of explaining the origin of life is by reference to chemical evolutionary processes. And I examine that thesis. I take it seriously, but I think that's inadequate. So I think the concept of God I have in mind is something that would be affirmed by traditional Jews and Christians and other traditional theists.
And theism, just define that for us quickly, as opposed to the other things.
Theism is the idea that there is a personal God, a God that has a mind and self-conscious deliberation, who created the universe and who is also active in the universe after the beginning. Deism is the concept that there's a God who transcends the universe, who's separate from the universe, who created the universe, but then had no involvement with the universe after the beginning. Pantheism, the Eastern concept of God is not a personal being. It's not a conscious intelligence to whom you could pray or with whom you could communicate, but rather a kind of mystical force or oneness, a sort of unity in all things, but not a person. And then there are variants of those concepts, panentheism and panpsychism. There's some, and I deal with those as well in the book. But so I look at these different philosophical options for explaining the crucial evidences that we have about the origin of the universe, the origin of the fine-tuning of the universe, and the origin of life, and argue that theism provides the best overall explanation of those three classes of evidence, looking at the competing, if you will, metaphysical hypotheses, the different worldviews that you could adopt as a philosopher.
Okay, so let's dig into the three recent discoveries that you believe support this.
Yeah, absolutely. They are, number one, that the universe had a beginning, as best we can tell from both the evidence of observational astronomy and theoretical physics. Secondly, that the universe has been finely tuned from the beginning and soon thereafter and by fine tuning, I mean precisely calibrated against all odds to allow for the possibility of life, and even, as it turns out, basic chemistry. And thirdly, that at the foundation of life, we have evidence of information in a functional and digital form. In fact, a whole complex information storage, transmission, and processing system in even the simplest living cells, suggesting, as I argue in the book, the need for a master programmer, the need for an intelligent agent to generate that information.
Okay, so and let's take them one at a time. So the first, you're essentially talking about scientific discoveries in the past 100 some odd years that tend to point to what's generally called the Big Bang.
The Big Bang, sure.
Which is what is commonly believed to be the creation of our universe. So that the fact that you can point to a beginning aids in arguing that there was a creator?
Correct. The story of the discovery of the beginning is fascinating because you first get indications of that from observational astronomy in Southern California, where you are, the Mount Wilson Observatory, where Hubble was. They were able first to detect that the light coming from distant galaxies was being stretched out, that as if the galaxies were receding from us, and light that's being stretched out has longer wavelengths. Longer wavelengths correspond to the redder end of the visible spectrum. So this evidence was called the redshift evidence, and it suggested a universe that was expanding outward in a roughly spherically symmetric way, like a balloon. And if you think of that in the forward direction of time, you have an expanding universe, but in the reverse direction of time, the galactic material would be getting closer and would have been closer and closer and closer together, and eventually converged on a point past which you cannot go, physically speaking. And that point would mark the beginning of the expansion and arguably the beginning of the universe. That evidence from observational astronomy was reinforced by developments in theoretical physics, starting mainly with Einstein's new theory of gravity, which was new in 1915, not new now, but called the idea of general relativity. And the idea of that was that massive bodies are actually curving the fabric of space such that if you had more and more mass concentrated more densely in the reverse direction of time, the curvature of space would be getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And in 1966, Stephen Hawking, in his PhD thesis, spent a chapter essentially proving that if you go back far enough, you reach a limiting case where the curvature of space goes to an infinite, corresponding to zero spatial volume. And at that point, when you have zero spatial volume, that corresponds to also no mass. You can't put anything in no space. So it's a kind of a limiting case, past which, as the British astrophysicist Paul Davies has pointed out, no physical reasoning is possible, and that marks the beginning of the universe. Now, there are ways around what Hawking and his colleagues George Ellis and Roger Penrose proved. They were called singularity theorems. There are ways around those, but there have been other proofs from theoretical physics based on special relativity that also established that time itself had a beginning. And so that is, I argue in the book, that as best we can tell, the universe had a beginning, and even the cosmological models that attempt to circumvent the beginning end up presupposing the singularity, and they have theistic implications for other reasons. This is highly significant from a philosophical point of view, because if you think of matter, space, time, and energy beginning to exist, you can't really explain the origin of the universe in materialistic terms. There was no matter prior to the origin of matter to do the causing. And so this is it was a very unsettling result for many scientific materialists. Robert Jastrow from the Goddard Space Institute memorably wrote a book called God and the Astronomers, concluding that the story of the discovery of the beginning ends like a bad dream for scientists who have lived by the power of reason. He says they scale the highest peak and they confront a band of theologians that have been waiting there for centuries. So the big problem is, how do you explain the origin of the material universe before there was matter to cause it to come into existence? The nature of the event requires a cause which transcends matter, space, time, and energy, the material realm.
Yeah, we don't have a scientific explanation for the moments before the Big Bang, right? That's the big open, unsettled question.
Well, in a sense, you can't have. I would say, how we define science is up for grabs, because this is an area where you've got scientific and philosophical considerations. What you can't have is a materialistic explanation. You might have a good explanation that is not materialistic. Maybe you don't call that scientific. That's okay. But the point is that you can't explain the origin of the physical universe by reference to physics, because it's the physical universe and physics that come into existence at that point in time. You can't explain it materialistically, because it's matter and energy that come into existence at that point in time. Robert Dicke, this famous physicist at Princeton, said an infinitely old universe would relieve us of the necessity of explaining the origin of matter at any finite time in the past.
So if we see a beginning there and no scientific explanation for how that began, that beginning took place, right? Essentially, or what it existed before. But okay, but then let's talk about God. So when did God come into existence?
The point that I have made is that every philosophical system has to posit something as what philosophers call a primitive, or the ultimate or prime reality. Prior to the discovery that the universe had a beginning, the default way of thinking among many scientists and philosophers, in some cases going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, but certainly through the 19th century, was the idea that the universe was eternal and self-existent. It had always been here, and therefore, per the quotation from Professor Dicke at Princeton that I just cited, there was no need to explain the origin of the universe in terms of anything else. It was the primary thing by which we explain everything else. It was the thing that had always been here. Carl Sagan, in his famous Cosmos series, which was rebooted by Neil deGrasse Tyson recently, had his famous sort of scientific naturalist mantra: the universe is all there is, all there ever was, all there ever will be. Well, it turns out the universe was not always here, and therefore it can't be invoked as the fundamental thing from which everything else comes. But something in every system of thought functions in that role. And so in theism, the thing that has always been here, that is the prime reality, that is the thing from which everything else comes, is God. And the new cosmology suggests that the theistic metaphysics is more consistent with the reality than the naturalistic or materialistic universe or metaphysics. In other words, the physical universe is a bad candidate to be the thing from which everything else comes, because it itself comes into existence a finite time ago. It has a beginning, and therefore would need to be created by something outside itself.
Mm-hmm. And this something else, just to go there for a moment, then I want to move on to number two. Theoretically, that is what has been around forever, this personal God.
Correct. We're positing as the prime reality something other than the universe, which makes sense given that the universe hasn't always been here. Right.
And what about the purpose of God creating what he created? Do you get into theories on that?
We can detect purposive intelligence without knowing all the purposes an intelligence might have. So I argue that the fine-tuning of the universe suggests that a purposive intelligence was responsible. I don't attempt to discern all the thoughts of the deity, but rather simply that the deity had thoughts and that they were expressed in the structure of the universe that was produced, that made life possible.
Okay, so let's go to, I think number two envelops the fine-tuning part, right? That you're saying we've seen fine-tuning in evolution.
Can I make one more point about the origin of the universe? The method of reasoning I use is the method that's used by historical scientists, and that is the method of inference to the best explanation. When you're looking at the evidence that the universe had a beginning, it then that leads you to ask, well, what sort of metaphysics, what sort of metaphysical hypothesis could explain that? Materialism fails because matter is what comes into existence. So materialism as a metaphysical system of thought fails. But both theism and deism posit an entity that is transcendent beyond the material universe that could act as a cause. So they function as better explanations than a materialistic worldview. So I'm actually using the method of inference to the best explanation, used commonly in science as well as in philosophy, to adjudicate or assess the competing worldviews or metaphysical hypotheses.
Right. Still just a theory, obviously.
Sure. We're using our reasoning to try to make the best sense of the evidence that we have.
Right. And we're kind of filling in a blank that we don't know, but I could argue on the other side that, well, we've filled in blanks before that science then later filled in. So,
well, it's how all science reasons. In fact, all theory, much of science. If we mean by if our definition of knowledge is the only things we know are the things that we can directly observe, then most of science would not constitute knowledge. But we make inferences in science from things we can observe to things that we don't observe. Theoretical physics is full of it. We think there are things called electrons and protons and neutrons and atoms. We don't directly see those, but we see effects that lead us to infer their existence. It's how we came to know about the DNA molecule as well.
Right.
So I'm using that same method of reasoning from things we can see to affirm the existence of the thing that would best explain the things that we do see. And in this case, that's a God hypothesis. Yeah.
When you say that we have levels of certainty in science, so the Big Bang being one of them. I mean, Big Bang is still technically a theory because we haven't seen it, right? So we haven't necessarily proven it. Maybe you would disagree with that, but I mean, we've to a certain level of scientific certainty, it's believed that it happened.
Well, right. We don't prove things in science. Mathematicians prove things from axioms, and they reason deductively from axioms. Scientists attempt to formulate theories, and they affirm as most likely to be true those theories that provide the best explanations of the evidence at hand. And I'm using that same method of reasoning to affirm, first, that there is evidence of a designing intelligence responsible for life, but secondly, that the designing intelligence responsible for life in the universe most likely has the attributes that Jews and Christians have always ascribed to God.
Mm-hmm. So whereas the Big Bang has been proven to a pretty high degree of certainty, at least among the scientific community, what you're positing as far as what precedes the Big Bang is a theory that fits. It certainly can't be disproven at this point. And you're saying you believe is essentially the best theory that's out there at the moment.
Well, the Big Bang is an event. It's the first event of the universe in which matter and energy burst into existence and begin to expand. We posited the Big Bang as an explanation for other evidences that we could see. The red shift, the cosmic background radiation, anomalies in the cosmic background radiation, et cetera. So using the same method of reasoning, now we take the Big Bang, the beginning of the universe, the fact of a beginning, as a point of data. I'm now asking, well, among the competing explanations for that, what would provide the best? What would provide the best causal explanation of the universe having a beginning? So I'm using the exact same method of reasoning. And if you evaluate the competing alternatives, materialism, pantheism, deism, theism, for example. Deism and theism provide good explanations for a beginning. Pantheism and materialism don't, so they're to be preferred as better explanations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's go to the fine-tuning elements, which you say provides further evidence of your theory. Because broadly speaking, when I think of the Big Bang, I think of that being the beginning of evolution that people commonly think about, is Darwinism type evolution, where we see the species, changing in from one thing to another. But from my kind of simplistic view of things, that evolution really started with the Big Bang, and you have things evolving and evolving and evolving as this universe is created.
Cosmic evolution, stellar evolution. Yeah, exactly. Right.
There you go.
Galactic evolution. Right.
There you go. And galaxies are formed, and stars are formed, and planets are formed, and solar systems, and so on. And then things start happening on some of these planets, in particular Earth, right? And that things start evolving on Earth, and that evolution just provides kind of the perfect explanation for everything that we've seen or can observe and study from the Big Bang forward. you're saying that no, actually, there's things that can't be explained by cosmic evolution / human evolution.
Well, evolution is a term that means lots of different things. If it means, it can mean change over time. Okay, so the universe is changing over time from the beginning till now. It can also refer to the very specific claims about certain mechanisms that are responsible for certain types of change. So, and with that, the notion that these changes are completely undirected or unguided and taking place only as the result of natural processes. So when you get to trying to explain the origin of the first cell on planet Earth, the theories that have been proposed usually fall under the heading of evolutionary abiogenesis, or chemical evolutionary theory. And the idea there is that the first life arose as the result of a series of undirected evolutionary changes among non-living chemicals over a vast amount of time. As we've attempted to simulate that in the laboratory, those processes turn out to be the chemistry that occurs naturally doesn't tend to lead in a life-friendly direction. And the only way to get it to move a little bit in a life-friendly direction is to manipulate it with the intelligent design of the experimentalist, which doesn't really simulate an undirected, unguided process of evolution. So the origin of the first life is a huge unsolved problem from the standpoint of evolutionary theory, in part because of the growing awareness we have of the integrated informational complexity that we're finding in living systems. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I want to make sure I'm understanding. So where you're saying we lack a good scientific explanation is the appearance of the first living cell on Earth. Is that what you're saying?
Where we lack a good evolutionary explanation is the appearance of the first living cell on Earth. I think intelligent design is a good scientific explanation for some of the features of those cells, in particular the origin of the digital code and the information processing systems that have been discovered inside cells.
Okay, and let's stick with that cell for a second. So this single cell,
right?
That's the mystery, how the single living cell was created, which was in the ocean somewhere, right?
Presumably, or a hydrothermal vent, or, I mean, people have been formulating all kinds of hypotheses about where a suitable environment might have been for this chemical evolutionary process to take place. But that was the original idea.
And have we or have we not found
a prebiotic soup? It was called. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Have we or have we not found a single living cell on, for instance, Mars?
No, we have not found a single living cell on Mars.
We found water, right? There's water there.
Right.
We haven't been able to take a sample.
Water is a necessary but nowhere near sufficient condition of life.
And we didn't find it on the moon?
Didn't find it on the moon. I have a colleague who jokes about finding Buicks on Io, the Jovian moon, the moon of Jupiter, because they found some evidence of iron or something on one of the moons. And he said, well, it's short. You need iron to make cars, so therefore there must be Buicks on Io. But this has been one of the fallacies in a lot of science reporting. If you find some constitutive element of a living system, then people jump to the conclusion that, hey, it's easy to produce life in these other environments. But there's a difference between a necessary and a sufficient condition. So water's necessary, but nowhere near sufficient producing.
Once we're able to do more experiments on Mars, do you believe it's possible we will find a living cell on Mars?
I think it's.
I mean, obviously anything's possible, but I mean, likely.
Well, it wouldn't be a matter of experiments. It'd be a question of whether there was life there or not. I don't think there are good indications that there is. I don't think it's likely that there will be life found on Mars. But okay. The question of where life is separate from the question of how it would be, what it would take to produce it. Let's say that you went to Antarctica and you were an explorer, and you had assumed that there was never any intelligent life on Antarctica. But you entered a large cave, and lo and behold, as you entered the cave, you found that there were these scratchings on the wall that looked like maybe Egyptian hieroglyphs or something similar to that. And then associated with these symbols, there were actually drawings of different types of animals indigenous to that, maybe penguins or something. And as you studied them for a while, you correlated the pictographs with the symbols, and you realized, no, this was an informational script. Though you had previously thought that there was no intelligent life on Antarctica, that no one had ever lived there, you would have to change your assessment because you had discovered information, and you know of only one cause of the origin of information, and that's mind. The scientists looking for extraterrestrial intelligence in the cosmos are assuming the same thing. They're looking for evidence of information embedded in radio signals. If they find it, they'll infer that there is an ET out there. Now, they haven't found it, but we have found information in a digital form stored in every single strand of DNA in every single cell. And that information is part of, as I mentioned, this complex information storage, transmission, and processing system that exceeds the complexity of our own high-tech digital technology. So just like the archaeologist in Antarctica, the most logical thing to conclude from the discovery of that information is that a mind played a role in the origin of that information, the information present in life.
And this sophisticated network that you describe is apparent in a single cell? Is a single cell that sophisticated?
In even the simplest living cells, even in bacterial cells, in what are
I mean, what is the simplest? What is this? If there was an initial cell, how would you define that cell? The first cell that ever appeared on Earth.
How would I? Well, we can look at our own cell. The cells that we have now, and look at there are two basic types of cells. There's eukaryotes and prokaryotes. The prokaryotes are cells without nuclei, and even they have these extraordinarily complex information processing systems inside them.
And so if the theory then is that you're saying there's no evolutionary explanation for the appearance of this cell. So you posit that essentially it was God that placed the cell there. And so people who are Christians today or believers today would have to believe not in this idea that humans are somehow special and unique in God's eyes, that really everything living on Earth, plants, animals, bugs, humans, all evolved from the single cell that God planted on Earth.
Oh, I'm not necessarily saying that there was then a seamless process of evolution from that point forward, but I am saying that you can't get to the first living cell via an evolutionary pathway that's undirected and unguided. What you see is evidence of design at the very beginning.
And
I think you see evidence of design down the timeline. There are subsequent events in the history of life that also manifest massive bursts of new information. I wrote a second book called about the Cambrian explosion, called Darwin's Doubt. So I don't necessarily concede the universal tree of life picture of the history of life, but the point is that even committed evolutionary biologists today acknowledge that we do not have a chemical evolutionary origin of explanation for the origin of the first life. Richard Dawkins, who's perhaps the foremost spokesman for scientific atheism in the world, in a 2008 interview he did with Ben Stein in a film called Expelled, openly acknowledged no one knows from an evolutionary point of view how the first life arose from simple chemicals in a prebiotic environment.
Yeah, it's not something
when I argue for intelligent design is the best explanation for the origin of the information necessary to produce the first life, I actually stand in no fear of contradiction. There isn't an adequate explanation that is strictly materialistic on offer.
So we've never. This is fascinating to me because it's not something I've ever focused on. The existence or creation of the first cell on Earth, but
it's super understandable because most people don't know that Darwin never really addressed that topic. Mm-hmm. In The Origin of Species, he presupposes one or a few very simple forms from which biological evolution would then unfold, but only in a single letter did he speculate about the origin of the first life to a friend named Joseph Hooker, and that's where we got the idea of the prebiotic soup. He talked about life possibly arising in a warm little pond of all the different
you're saying we've never in a lab in a petri dish created a cell?
No, nowhere near.
We've caused cells to expand or to.
Well, we've done experiments where we put DNA from one cell into another, things like that. But there's no, there has never been a synthetic form of life developed in a laboratory.
But what about just, standing water, which creates mold and bacteria and all kinds of nonsense? I mean, isn't that
that's the old
created?
idea of spontaneous generation from the 19th century. Louis Pasteur and others refuted that. When you have the appearance of life coming out of nowhere, it's usually from spores or bacteria that were there pre-existent, and we didn't see them. So no, life has not been generated or created in a laboratory by human beings. But if it were, notice what it would show. If it took human ingenuity to structure a bunch of chemicals to create life, then what would you be simulating? You wouldn't be simulating an undirected, unguided chemical process. You'd be simulating the need for intelligent design. This is one of the arguments I make in the book. There are what are called ribozyme engineering experiments or prebiotic simulation experiments where the chemist actively is manipulating a series of chemical reactions to move chemistry in a more complex, more life-friendly direction, more life-relevant direction, trying to produce some of the precursors of biological molecules. But those experiments, to the extent they've been successful, have been successful because of the active manipulation and guidance of an intelligent agent. So the simulation experiments are meant by the logic of origin of life research to simulate what might have been happening on the early Earth. But if you can't get the life to move if you can't get the chemistry to move in a life-friendly direction without the use of intelligence, you're not simulating an undirected, unguided process. You're simulating the need for intelligent design.
Yeah, but I mean, all science is directed by intelligent humans. So you would discredit any scientific discovery with that argument?
No. Much science involves intelligent humans observing processes in nature that take place without our assistance, guidance, or direction. When we have to assist, guide, and direct to get the outcome we want, we can't say that that's simulating what nature would do on its own.
Okay. So now let's move to what you're saying is, no, Jim, I'm not saying that the single cell that was created by God resulted in all the evolution that we see today, including the creation of humans. You believe that then God interceded at other points. So how many other times did he intercede, or what was the main?
Well, I think it's first important to understand the argument, the way I've unfolded the argument. In my book, Signature in the Cell, I made the case for the intelligent design as the best explanation for the origin of the information needed to build the first life. And I didn't conclude from that alone that the designing agent was necessarily God. To bring the God hypothesis into the discussion, I expanded in this new book, I expand the data under examination and look at what we know from physics and cosmology about the universe having been finely tuned from the beginning. The fine tuning, I argue, is evidence of a fine tuner, as many physicists themselves have pointed out. And that evidence of design is present from the very beginning of the universe. So if you only had evidence of design long after the beginning, you might consider the possibility that the designing agent had been an agent within the cosmos. And no less a person in science than Francis Crick proposed that idea. It's called Panspermia. Dawkins actually floated the idea in this interview that I mentioned with Ben Stein. And I argue that ends up not being a very good explanation of the origin of life, because if life was seeded here by an intelligent agent that evolved someplace else in the cosmos, you still got to get that evolutionary process going, which would require a first cell and information. And if you can't solve the information problem on planet Earth, it doesn't solve it just to kick it out into outer space. But secondly, and even more fundamentally, no being within the cosmos could explain the origin of the cosmos itself a finite time ago, or the fine-tuning of the universe that makes its very life possible. So the alien designer idea, I argue, is not as good an explanation of the overall ensemble of evidence that we have from biology, physics, and cosmology as the God hypothesis. So I don't jump immediately to the God hypothesis from the design evident in life to infer that the kind of intelligence that we have involves a transcendent mind. You have to look at the physics and the cosmology as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. And what are the elements that you believe indicate that God has interceded more than just by planting a single cell on Earth?
I think the evidence of what is called fossil discontinuity throughout the history of life. I look at another similar, or a very striking example of this in my second book, Darwin's Doubt. There is an event in the history of life known as the Cambrian explosion, in which most of the major animal, what are called body plans, emerge abruptly in the fossil record with no evidence of a prior a series of prior transitional intermediates, as you would expect on a Darwinian view. And that presents two mysteries. One, the first mystery is, where are all the missing intermediates if a gradualistic Darwinian process had produced all these new forms of animal life? But secondly, it also creates a mystery of how these animal forms would have been built. Because post Watson and Crick and the molecular biological revolution, we know that building new forms of animal life requires new information. If you want to give your computer a new function, you've got to provide new code. If you want to build a new form of animal life with new organs and tissues and an overall body plan, you need both genetic information and other forms of biological information to accomplish that. The evolutionary process would need to do that. When you examine the evolutionary models on offer, they either presuppose pre-existing unexplained information, or they don't address that fundamental informational problem. And so I think that when you have these big events in the history of life where you see massive innovation in biological form, implying the need for new bursts of biological information, I think those are likely events that also required the action of an active designing intelligence.
Mm-hmm. So what you're really referring to, correct me if I'm wrong, is what people commonly refer to as the missing link. So missing links between this and that, which some of those have subsequently links have been found, right? So there's been unexplained how we got from this to this, and then later more discoveries reveal those links. So
the overall pattern in the fossil record is one of discontinuity. There are examples of continuous change, but at what are called lower taxonomic levels, at species, genus, maybe up to the level of family. When you're looking at the major innovation in the history of life, or fundamentally new forms of life, fundamentally new body plans, where a body plan is a unique way of arranging body parts and tissues. When you see new body plans come into existence, we're talking about in the higher taxonomic categories of classes, the phyla, the classes, the orders. These events are almost universally highly discontinuous. The abrupt change in form, abrupt new innovation in the history of life. So
just tick through us real quickly, if you could, just the major ones that you're talking about that don't really have an evolutionary explanation.
Yeah, things like the Cambrian explosion, the explosion of the mammalian radiation, the appearance of flowering plants, the Cretaceous. I have an article I wrote with the German paleontologist Gunter Beckley about 17 major innovations in the history of life that are profoundly discontinuous and lack ancestral fossils.
So these would be examples of under your theory that God interceded and decided that on this little tiny rock in this humongous universe, I'm going to plant this single cell, and then later, a few 100 million years later, what have you, he decides, now I'm going to put a plant there, and then 100 million years after that, I'm going to put a little animal here, or a little bug, or whatever. So this is an intelligent,
I see
personal God.
I see evidence of design in those events because of the large discontinuous increases in the information content of the biosphere at those points.
So that's a God, but under that.
Let me come back at you a little bit, because just the tone of your question is sort of designed to make this sound implausible. But let's compare it to something. How plausible is it that undirected, unguided processes produced all these beautiful organ structures and body plans and informational codes that are necessary to build these living organisms without the guidance of an intelligent agent? we've gotten used to thinking in a sort of a default materialism, where anything that involves mind or agency is somehow like something spooky or weird. But maybe it's more weird to think of nature, brute matter, having these the properties of ingenuity on its own. And so it's I just push back at the sort of the kind of the incredulity that we reflexively feel about talking about the action of an agent in the history of life. Okay, that's, we're not used to thinking that way. We've inherited a way of thinking from the late 19th century that says that, that nature has these properties. We should not be talking about creative intelligence as an explanation.
Right.
But we're looking at features in living systems which in any other realm of experience would immediately trigger an awareness of the activity of a designing mind. I had a Microsoft engineer who was working with us, he wrote 10,000 lines of code to simulate what's called the gene expression system, how the information in DNA directs the construction of proteins. He came into my office one day and threw a book down on my table called Design Patterns. It's a standard design manual for software engineers. And a design pattern, he explained to me, is an established way of storing or processing digital information. And he said, in order to write the code to simulate how the information in DNA is being expressed to produce proteins, I'm encountering all kinds of design patterns that I recognize from high-tech digital computing. In the cell, you have automated error correction. Well, we have a spell check in our computers, in our software in our word processing programs. We've got information compression technologies. We've got cryptographic decoding technologies. So this is very sophisticated information technology that we're finding in even the simplest living cells. And so it might be time to not only change our theories, but our sensibilities that suggest that if we're invoking something other than a purely materialistic explanation, that we've somehow jumped off the edge of the rational universe.
Yeah. Well, look, I find evolution difficult to believe also. So don't get me wrong. I mean, the idea that everything created from this single cell, it is hard to believe. It does seem to be at this point the best scientific explanation, but there's gaps in it and holes in it, and it is hard to believe. But it isn't. But let me just finish my point. Yeah, but it is rational though. It does seem to make rational sense that even though it's kind of hard to believe, but that that all these things could evolve over that time period and so on, although we are talking about a long period of time, it does make logical sense, I believe. Anyway, you could disagree with that, and that's fine. But so I'm only saying that, okay, if you're going to posit a different theory than this, then you're also going to have to explain also a bit how it's rational, how it's rational that this this God would choose to do these things at these certain times. And, what's the thinking behind this? Why did he start just with a cell and then later decide I'm going to put a plant and later put this and later put this and later put this? Is there any logical or rational explanation for that?
Well, you could ask the same question of the evolutionary process. Why?
Right, but I'm asking you right now.
No. Let me come back at you, because you've got an underlying premise that I want to challenge. We use the notion of agency to explain all kinds of things. If you go to South Dakota and look at Mount Rushmore, and someone asks you, how did those faces get on the mountain? If you say, well, must have been wind and erosion, I can't really think about creative intelligence playing a role, that would not be a rational explanation, because you have experience of the production of shapes that conform to the human face, what artists do. And you have ways of detecting the activity of intelligent agents. We detect the activity of intelligent agents all the time. Turns out that there are methods of design detection that can be formalized. That's been part of the work of the people who work on intelligent design. And so if you go to the British Museum and you look at the Rosetta Stone, and somebody says, well, how did those characters get on there, and those hieroglyphs and symbols? And you say, well, that was wind and erosion as well. That would not be a rational explanation, in that it contradicts what we know from our uniform and repeated experience about what it takes to generate information. So what we're doing in work on intelligent design is identifying features that we know from experience are always the product of intelligent agents, and we're finding those features in living systems or in the foundational structure of the physical universe and the fine-tuning. So the inference to intelligence is not an unrational inference. It's a perfectly rational inference, and it's a kind of inference we make all the time in our daily lives because we see evidence of intelligence and the echo of the effects that intelligent agents leave behind.
Yeah, but the rationality and logic that I'm talking about is, why would God intercede in the ways that he has interceded?
We may not be able to answer all of those questions, but we may still be able to detect the activity of such an intelligent agent. We can ask the exact same question of, if you accept that mutation and selection produced everything, you could say, well, why did this mutation happen at this time, causing, the Stegosaurus to arise from some, we don't have answers to those types of questions.
But usually it's response to environment where a species adapts.
Yeah, but those environments are never specified. We don't really know, and we also know, more to the point, that mutations tend to degrade information rather than generate it, which is one of the reasons that leading evolutionary biologists share a lot of your skepticism about the current adequacy of evolutionary theory. Is that the mutation selection mechanism seems to do a very good job of explaining small-scale variation, but it doesn't do a good job at all of explaining major innovations in the history of life where you need a lot of new information to build new structures.
Where are you on the question of capital letters, the missing link, the link between humans and apes? Or do you believe that we evolved from apes, or would that be a situation where God interceded?
I'm skeptical about the paleoanthropological accounts of human origin. I think there's a lot of discontinuity there, not only at the level, not only in the fossil record, but in the genomic record as well. We're discovering that a lot of what are called orphan genes are present in the human genome. So there's more genomic discontinuity than previously thought. So I'm skeptical about that. I could be shown wrong, and maybe there's a convincing account, but I'm skeptical about it. So I think there's certainly things about human beings that are absolutely unique and discontinuous. One is our ability to use language, and the origin of language is profound mystery, because after all, to get a language system going, you need a language system. You need a symbol convention by which to communicate, to establish a new symbol convention. So it's very difficult to imagine how language gets going in a gradual evolutionary way. And yet that's one of the most distinctive features about human beings that we not only take for granted, we're using right now in order to communicate. So I think that humans are unique in a qualitative sense, and I'm skeptical about their a purely discontinuous or a purely continuous, undirected evolutionary explanation for their origin.
Mm-hmm. So would that be evidence or an example of God's most recent interceding in what otherwise is this evolutionary theory, is putting humans on Earth?
Yeah, it could possibly be, but I've not written about that, and that's not been the focus. I've been looking at the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning, the origin of life, and I have written a book about the origin of the animal life. So I'm not an expert on paleoanthropology, but I'll tell you that just informally, I'm skeptical about the standard account.
Mm-hmm. So, and all of this is we're in kind of the number 2 discovery, right? Which pertains to the idea that the fossil records don't seem to provide a smooth, purely evolutionary explanation for all of the life that we see so far, and therefore.
I see how you're numbering them. No problem. Well, I in the book I address them in the following order: first, the origin of the universe, the fine tuning, and then the origin of the information necessary to the first life and to major innovations in the history of life. So, yeah, that would be. What you called number 2 was my number 3, but no big deal. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think I'm confusing those two, but let me make sure I understand number 2. So number 2 is again the fact that we don't have records to explain certain leaps from one species to another species.
Well, it's not so much. There's plenty of speciation. It's the higher taxonomic categories that exhibit this profound discontinuity. So you have species, genus, family, order, class, and phyla. The phyla and classes describe what are called separate body plans, where you have unique ways of arranging body parts, tissues, organs into a particular architecture, and those unique architectures arise in the history of life very abruptly. And so that's a case where there's a massive amount of new genetic information, something else we haven't really talked about, but something called onto or epigenetic information that's stored at a higher level than the DNA. And so I discussed this a lot in the book about the Cambrian explosion. But yeah, there are these big abrupt changes, and it isn't just that the ancestral fossils are missing. It's that to build these unique body plans and architectures, the evolutionary process would have to generate a vast amount of genetic and other higher forms of information to build these systems. And in Darwin's Doubt, I show why that's implausible from the standpoint of really any of the major evolutionary models that are currently on offer. They either presuppose pre-existing forms of information or they fail to explain the information required.
But when it comes to evolution, generally, you agree with it. You think that it is a proper scientific theory and does, in fact, explain a lot of changes that you see in species, and perhaps explains life coming out of the ocean and fish crawling out of the ocean and turning into reptiles, et cetera?
Well, I think that evolution is a real, the mutation and selection is a real process. There are continuous changes within many of the lower taxonomic groups that can be mapped. So evolutionary biologists have also often made a distinction between macro and microevolution. I'm skeptical about the sufficiency of mutation and selection to explain the major innovations in the history of life, which would be sometimes equated with macroevolution. I'm perfectly in agreement with the reality of microevolutionary processes of speciation and adaptation and the like.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then then I think I'm understanding too. So 3 is really seeing the third discovery is seeing intelligent design that you think cannot be explained through evolution. Is that am I getting number 3 correct, or is that number 2 as far as the scientific discovery?
Well, the number 2 is the fine tuning argument. Yeah. So
right.
yeah. So
and then number 3. You just describe number 3 for me again.
Number 3 is the discovery of the informational properties of life that are best explained, I argue, by reference to a designing intelligence, rather than an undirected, unguided process such as mutation and natural selection.
Mm-hmm. And the best example of that is what?
The origin of the first life, the origin of the animal. That would be the best example. The second book I wrote was about the origin of the new animal forms in the Cambrian explosion of life.
Okay, gotcha. And what about the idea that, you talk about humans are actually creating things that are very much like the things that we're seeing in DNA and so on. The idea that humans could somehow create themselves and create life. I mean, it reminds me of this movie Ex Machina, where if you saw that, artificial intelligence, and next thing you know, this thing could theoretically procreate and so on. I mean, is this something that you think about, or I mean, it really means that.
There's a very good new book out right now called "The Myth of Artificial Intelligence," and it's written by the computer scientist and philosopher Eric Larson, published with Harvard University Press. And part of the problem of AI with intelligent systems is to get them to create things that are smarter than themselves. And one of the problems that early AI people realized is that we had a hard time thinking of how to create a system smarter than ourselves. That humans, and we haven't devised a smarter version of a human. So why do we think that machines are going to be able to devise a smarter version of themselves, where smarter means acquiring what's called general intelligence rather than task-specific knowledge about solving a problem like playing chess or something. So I'm not sure where you were heading with that, but this is the
well,
mystery,
I guess, I guess when, as we think about a creator, I guess I'm talking about the possibility of a terrestrial creator, because, in other words, just to throw something silly out there, that, this was a guy playing around in a lab that somehow created the Big Bang type of thing, because, as we see now, it's pretty amazing what humans are now able to create, and probably can create things that themselves will procreate, or theoretically could create that in the future.
Well, I address this very directly in the book, because there is a hypothesis that advances this. It's called, as I mentioned before, panspermia, the idea that life was seeded here on Earth by some intelligent agent on maybe some other planet or somewhere within the cosmos. Or even if you want to say there was a creator of all of us that was pre-existed us on the planet, a terrestrial intelligence. Either way, any intelligent agent within the universe cannot account for the origin of the universe itself, or the fine-tuning of the physical parameters, the very fabric of physics and chemistry that make its origin and evolution possible. So no being within the cosmos, I think, is going to be an adequate explanation for all three of the big three facts that I'm looking at. The
it would have to be a terrestrial being that created the Big Bang. So there would have to be something.
Yeah, but how's that work?
Extra universe. There would have to either be multiple universes.
Well, unpack that. I'd love to talk about multiple universes, but unpack that for me. How does a guy sitting in a lab create the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, when he's sitting on a rocky planet in a galaxy?
He'd have to be in another universe, basically.
In another universe. So you have a guy in another universe. Okay.
Right.
So the multiverse hypothesis is quite popular now, so we should talk about that. It's been proposed for various reasons, but I think its popularity is a function of its use as an explanation for the incredible improbability of this ensemble of fine-tuning parameters that I was talking about. And in other words, it's been used as an alternative to the intelligent design explanation for the precise fine-tuning that we find in the physical universe, the so-called Goldilocks universe. And the multiverse, it's intriguing, but it has a problem. In order for the multiverse hypothesis to work as an explanation for the fine-tuning, you can't just have separate universes out there. If all the universes are causally disconnected from each other and from our own, then nothing that happens in another universe, even a guy fiddling in a laboratory with a computer, isn't going to affect what happens in this universe. So in order to depict our universe as kind of the lucky winner of a great cosmic lottery, all multiverse hypotheses have proposed what are called universe-generating mechanisms. Some are based on something called string theory. Others are based on something called inflationary cosmology. But it turns out that these universe-generating mechanisms, even in theory, to produce new universes, themselves have to be precisely finely tuned. In other words, the universe-generating mechanisms depend upon prior unexplained fine-tuning. So the object initially was to use the multiverse to explain the fine-tuning in our universe, but to do so, you need universe-generating mechanisms that themselves require prior unexplained fine-tuning. So you haven't really explained the ultimate origin of the fine-tuning. You've just pushed it back one generation. Mm-hmm. And that would include, presumably, the fine-tuning necessary to produce a little guy on a computer in some universe trying to spin out other universes. I mean, eventually you've got to explain that original fine-tuning. And fine-tuning is, again, a type of phenomenon which we know from experience is always the product of intelligence. When we say something is finely tuned, we mean there's an ensemble of improbable parameters that jointly function to exemplify a set of functional requirements or produce a functional outcome. And so we could think of a French recipe as a finely tuned system, or an internal combustion as a finely tuned system, or a section of digital code or computer hardware is finely tuned. What do all those things have in common? They have in common a prior intelligent agent having played a role in their origin. So if the multiverse doesn't ultimately explain fine-tuning, that leaves only one known cause and explanation of fine-tuning, and that's intelligence. So I think that even if the multiverse is true, you still have evidence for intelligent design.
What about this one? I think it's been semi-disproven. It's a kind of a simplistic explanation, but this would be one for that the universe has just always been there, that it's you have the Big Bang, which causes this explosion, and everything is moving apart from each other and growing and growing and growing, and that eventually the energy from the Big Bang recedes to the point where essentially gravity takes hold, and then everything starts coming back together again, and then has another Big Bang, and that the universe just keeps going in and out.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, that's another good question. This is called the oscillating universe model, or sometimes called a cyclical universe model. These were pretty popular in the 1980s in cosmology because it did a nice job of accounting for the observational evidence of an expansion. Because we could say we're in the expansion phase right now, but later we'll recollapse and then expand again and recollapse and expand and recollapse. Two problems. One emerged. One was that there doesn't seem to be enough gravitational mass in the universe, even counting dark matter, to cause a recollapse. And with that, there's evidence of the universe actually accelerating in its expansion, which suggests that we're not going to get the recollapse. But secondly, maybe more fundamentally, it's a physicist at MIT named Alan Guth who evaluated this from the standpoint of thermodynamics. And he showed that if there were this series of expansions and collapses, you get a greater dispersion of matter with each cycle, which means more entropy would build up, which means there would be less energy available to do work. So each successive expansion would be a little bit less of an expansion than the one before. It'd be like dropping a ball, and initially it bounces pretty high, but then it damps down and eventually bounces less and less and less and finally settles to the floor. So if the universe was infinitely old, if you would expect that we would have already reached a point where the whole damping effect would have taken place, and we would have reached that point of would have been a nullifying equilibrium where we would be beyond any more bounces. We'd already be experiencing heat death, as the physicists call it. But since we don't live in such a universe, even if there were a number of cycles before us, they wouldn't have gone back infinitely. There must have been a beginning. Even if there were previous cycles, they couldn't have gone on infinitely into the past, or we would have already reached that point of nullifying thermodynamic equilibrium.
Okay, last two quick questions just to sneak in. One is
your questions aren't quick; they're deep. So,
I can ask them quickly. Can they be answered quickly?
Well, it's always hard to answer them, but you come prepared with multiverses and oscillating universes. That's a pretty good interview. So, thank you.
So, bottom line, under your theory, where would this leave us as far as life on another planet?
Agnostic. Could be, might not be. It was assumed for a long time that life somewhere else in the universe was pretty much probabilistically inevitable because there were so many, there's 200 billion galaxies, right? Which is a stunning find in just the last century. I mean, in 1920, we didn't know that. They were still debating whether the Milky Way was the only one, but we now think there is on order of 200 billion galaxies, maybe more. So that's a lot of places where life could evolve. But the other problem is that the conditions under which the evolution of life could occur are so incredibly improbable that there's been a new strain of thinking among astronomers. A very important book by two University of Washington astronomers, Don Brownlee and Peter Ward, called Rare Earth, and another book called Privileged Planet by astronomer Guillermo Gonzalez and philosopher Jay Richards. They argue that there's a lot of different places where life could have arisen. You can think of that as the numerator, but if we think of the denominator of all the different conditions that have to be met, that 200 billion galaxies may be small in comparison to the number of things that would have to be just right to get life going. So I think it's an open question, but we have found no evidence of extraterrestrial life. And even the extrasolar planets that we found are not suitable for life. They have highly eccentric orbits, or where they get too hot, too cold in their orbital cycle to sustain life. So it's an open question, but I don't think we should assume that it's inevitable just because there's a lot of stuff out there.
But under your theory, wouldn't you assume that it would require God to intercede to create that? Since You're saying that there's really no explanation for the single cell appearance.
I think it would. I think if by life we mean something similar to what we have on planet Earth, where we have a membrane that separates the living system from its environment, if we have metabolic processes held far from thermodynamic equilibrium, if we have information and information processing systems maintaining that far from equilibrium state, what we know about systems that have those type of attributes is they always arise from a designing intelligence. And the chemical, there's nothing about chemistry, brute chemistry, that suggests that chemistry could arrange itself into something even resembling a living cell.
Like when you talk about the
apart from intelligence.
Yeah, when you talk about everything having to be just right, what you're really talking about, based on your theory, I believe, is that can sustain life, but not necessarily create it. Because aren't you arguing that that it's not possible for a single cell to be created?
No, I think single cells can be created by designing intelligences. But what I am arguing is that the kinds of features that we find in living organisms found in any other environment always require intelligence to arise. So I'm arguing that we would like, if life arises someplace else in the cosmos, yes, it likely did so by intelligent design.
Mm-hmm. And last is this God that you are formulating, theist explanation. How does that jive with the Christian Bible? Is the Christian Bible hold up under this theory or not?
Yeah, it confirms key parts of it without telling the whole story. The first words of the Bible are, after all, in the beginning. And I would say the Hebrew Bible, as well as the Christian New Testament, the Judeo-Christian scriptures, affirm the existence of a transcendent intelligence who is active in the creation. I think that's what we see from the scientific evidence. The Judeo-Christian conception of God isn't the only conception of God that the only conception of God that confirms or comports with that description. But what we find in nature does comport with what the Judeo-Christian conception of God is.
And the creation story that is in the Bible, what would you make of that?
Well, I don't get into that very deeply, but the first part of it certainly is correct. In the beginning is what the cosmologists are now talking about, as well as the writers of the Hebrew Bible. There's a great physicist, Arno Penzias, who discovered the cosmic background radiation, one of the key evidences of the Big Bang. He says the data we have are exactly what I would have predicted if I had nothing to go on but the first 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. So I think the testimony of nature is remarkably consistent with the overall biblical view.
But you're not out to prove a Christian God per se, as opposed to a God who's present. And
I definitely am a Christian, and
right.
I think the evidence supports the theistic concept of God that Christians presuppose. But other monotheistic faiths would also appreciate the arguments that I'm making, I think.
Thank you again to Stephen Meyer. You can check out his new book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. It's available on Amazon. Thank you to our producer, Michael Parker. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back soon with another episode of The Hidden Truth Show.
Thank you for listening to The Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow. You can find us at hiddentruthshow.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Truth Show. Join us again next week for another episode of Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow.